Thank you all so much for coming. This is amazing. Great turnout. It's my incredible pleasure to introduce these authors to you. They're all amazing, and their new books are all incredible. I definitely recommend checking them out. Gabino Iglesias is the author of the Shirley Jackson and Bram Stoker award-winning novel, The Devil Takes You Home, as well as author of the critically acclaimed and award-winning novels, Zero Saints and Coyote Songs. He is a writer, journalist, professor, and literary critic living in Austin, Texas. He's also the horror columnist for the New York Times Book Review. Shaun Hamill received his BA in English from the University of Texas at Arlington and his MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. His debut novel, A Cosmology of Monsters, was published in 2019. His fiction has appeared in Carve and Come Join Us by the Fire 2. His nonfiction has appeared at Crime Reads and Tor Nightfire. He lives and works near Dallas-Fort Worth. And Lee Mandelo is a writer, critic, and occasional editor whose field of interest includes speculative and queer fiction, especially when the two coincide. His debut novel, Summer Suns, which has been featured in NPR and the Chicago Review of Books, is a contemporary Southern Gothic dealing with queer masculinity, fast cars, and ugly inheritances. Other work can be found in magazines such as Tor.com, Uncanny, and Nightmare. He has also been a past nominee for awards including the Nebula, Lambda, and Hugo. Aside from a stint overseas learning to speak Scouse, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Amazing. Mandelo has spent his life ranging across Kentucky, currently living in Louisville and pursuing a PhD at the University of Kentucky. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to start us off by introducing your new book and telling us a little about it.
Oh.
All right, yeah. We actually planned that. New one, you said. Okay, House of Bone and Rain. It's not for children, tell you that much. It's about a group of guys, and one of them gets, his mother gets killed, two shots to the face while working at a club, so they decide they're gonna rain down some vengeance. But they're just about to graduate high school and they're not badasses. So they take advantage of a Hurricane Maria plummeting Puerto Rico into perpetual darkness for months, and a lot of bad things happen, and I'll leave it there.
My new book is called The Dissonance. It's about a group of friends in a small Texas town in the 1990s who discover that magic is real, but it is predicated on the idea that there is something broken in the fundament of existence, a tension between the way things ought to be and how they actually are, and that tension, which is called the dissonance, can only be manipulated by people who, I'm throwing air quotes around this, are a little bit broken, so people who are maybe neurodivergent or carrying a lot of trauma or mental illness. So basically it's all focused around like pain and discomfort, and it's about them sort of growing closer. It's about friendship between outsiders, and it sort of moves back and forth between the 90s and the present day when the adult versions of these characters, the surviving characters, return back to this town after not seeing or speaking to each other for 20 years because the ghosts of their past will not stay quiet. And so it's sort of about wrestling with your past and friendship and, how that can shape you over a lifetime.
Yeah, my newest is The Woods All Black. It is a novella that is set in 1929 in eastern Kentucky and is on one level about the frontier nursing service, some wild history if you want to look into that, but what it's really about is a T for T revenge story about religious trauma and bodily autonomy, and there is monster fucking. It's also not for kids. Yeah.
Now you tell me.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a weird night.
See, I don't even want to ask questions. I just want y'all to go. Just keep going.
No, you got notes, man.
I got notes. Okay, I'm just going to go down this. Remember, if it's a bad question, skip it. Let's start with the basics. What first got you into horror?
what first got me into horror? Surprise, I was not a good kid. So I spent a lot of times they would just send me to the library. So shout out to librarians. Woo! I know we got some librarians in the house. Let me tell you this. If you want to identify who the bad people are, go to any country in the world. Look for the folks messing with the librarians. That's the enemy, always. So the librarian took me in. Her name was Esperanza. We call her Espy. Esperanza is hope in English, so you couldn't make this up. And she usually just told me, don't burn anything, but just pick a book and read. And I found Horacio Quiroga, Tales of Love, Madness, and Death. And probably about a month after that, my dad, who has no education whatsoever, doesn't speak a word of English, but he's a big reader. He was always getting books from friends, and he said, you're getting into horror and dark stuff. I started this book, it's not for me, and I think I was like 12 or 13, and he gave me Richard Lehman's Endless Night. And I shouldn't have been reading that. But in my parents' defense, we didn't have middle grade and YA back in the day. You went from like Dr. Seuss to Stephen King, and there was no middle ground. And I read those, and I felt something. I was like, if I turn off the light in the kitchen and I run to my room, giving other people that feeling is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And took a while, but here we are.
Yeah.
For me, it, I think, started with Ghostbusters. The movie and the cartoon, I was just obsessed with it, but it just sort of metastasized from there. Specifically, I mean, I guess the trademark moment for me was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. And I can't remember who did those amazing illustrations, but I'm so happy that they're still in stores and that they look the way they did when I was a kid, because that seems like an easy target for sanitation. So I'm glad that they've left that, because it was way too dark and way too intense for a third grader, but it was perfect for me. And it just kind of snowballed from there into Stephen King, Anne Rice, all the usual suspects, and has been with me ever since.
Yeah, I think similarly, as being a kid who was growing up in rural Kentucky in the 90s as like a queer person and a transsexual, there wasn't a lot to read at all, but what there was a lot of queer horror fiction. And as an adult and a scholar now, I get it. The 90s, things were happening. It makes sense that a lot of the queer fiction was horror fiction, but I distinctly remember Billy Martin, who was writing as Poppy Zebright at the Times, Drawing Blood. Someone gave it to me in like hushed secret in middle school. It was like, I think this is it. I think you'll really like this. And I sure did. And it's another case. I think we always say, oh, we were too young. But were we? Like, if it was the right book for the moment, were you? And I really needed that book at that moment. And I've stuck with it also ever since.
That's an amazing thing. And it's something I feel like we can all relate to, is this finding the exact right book at the exact right time. And even stuff that we weren't supposedly old enough for, like those Scary Stories illustrations. The one that always sticks in my head is the one where the woman's face is exploding and there's spiders coming out.
Oh yeah.
Give it to kids, it's great.
Rent-free in my head forever, yeah.
Well, based on, going down the list of questions here, kind of the natural world pops up in all three of your books in really interesting ways, as both a source of horror and a source of relief. And Shaun, in there's multiple natural worlds. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Start with you this time?
All right. Yeah. I do think part of it is just growing up in rural Kentucky, and my extended family, who I don't have relation to anymore, are all from Mize, Mississippi. So I spent summers down there as a kid. And I do think there's both a freedom to being unobserved, right? Like, you're out in nature, no one can see you, you are free from whatever social pressures and violence are facing you potentially, but it's also an isolated place where you don't know what's behind you and you don't know who could be coming up behind you while you're out there. So I feel like there's always a balance for me in how I miss nature and being out in the woods if I'm in a city, but if I'm out somewhere with a lot of nature, there's a different kind of threat usually associated with that. So I have a really complicated back and forth emotionally, I think, with it, which is great for horror fiction because it's cool, but it's also scary.
I I'm not really sure because I've been reading some fiction that I feel like deals with place in ways that I really envy lately, like Gabino's newest book, and also my friend Travis Simpson had his first novel come out, and it's like so deeply rooted in a specific region of Arkansas, and that was something I wanted to get at a little bit because I grew up in a suburb that, yes, it was in Texas, but it wasn't probably that different from a suburb anywhere else in the United States in most respects. And so with my second book, I deliberately set it in a much smaller town than the one I grew up in. And both my novels have alternate worlds in them. And what I just realized is that in the first one, most of it is in a suburb, and the alternate world is this giant, weird city. And in the new book, it's a small town and just this desolate, weird, empty place. And I think I was also going for a little bit of what Lee was talking about, it's a lot easier for kids to get away with doing magic if there isn't anyone around to see them. And it's a lot easier to do that in a small town where, you can just wander off into the woods. So I would like to get more rooted in my future work in, like, the place where I grew up instead of it just sort of being set dressing, which is kind of how it feels to me. So yeah, I don't know if I've got a great answer there, but.
I got distracted because I owe you money now. But we're talking about nature.
Yeah.
I've always loved that quote that the universe is brutally indifferent to the existence of man. And I think that applies to, like, cosmic horror. Like, we're nothing. We're a speck of dust floating in blackness. But right here on this little chunk of salt water and rock, you find that in nature. So I was like 6 or 7, born and raised in Puerto Rico, ESL, and I saw Jaws. And I was like, I'm never getting in the water again. And then I learned about the rest of the world, and it's like I was reading a book. It's a nonfiction book, blanking on the author, obviously, about the Dyatlov Pass incident. And the guy who wrote that book spent $600 buying shoes, special shoes, so he could go trek up that mountain. And as he's going up, he tells the guy who's giving him the ride up there, he's like, man, I spent $600 in these shoes. My feet are cold. And the guy turns to him and he says, this is Siberia. Of course your feet are cold. And I was like, wow, if you try to cross Alaska on foot, something's going to eat you. So for this novel, I wanted that. I wanted a force that does not care about humanity. And being born and raised in Puerto Rico, my family never had money to run away when the hurricanes came. So for all Caribbean island folks, it's the same. Puerto Rico is 100 miles long by 35 miles wide. The hurricane's coming, grab onto something because you're not hiding from it. And I wanted that. I wanted a brutal force that's not necessarily evil because it doesn't have any evil intent. It's almost like a god that doesn't care about the little ants. And I knew that putting Hurricane Maria, which we're still dealing with, and which killed almost 3,000 people back home, I knew that was like the perfect thing from nature to use in the book because it matched the darkness of the rest of the book, and it also let me do that fun thing that I think everyone in this panel does, which is I'm going to talk to you about horror, but then I'm also going to talk to you about stuff that maybe if I'm trying to sell you a book and I go like, hey, it's about being a person of color, or it's about, it's about bad people doing bad things and colonialism, then you're like, not that excited. So I made the hurricane, which, by the way, the word hurricane we get from huracán, which is a Taino and Arahuaca word. I wanted it to be, once again, kind of like a dark god. And nature lets us do that because it doesn't care. Yeah, and even with that in mind, I will still pick bear over man. But I'm fully aware that the bear can eat me. So it's like, it's fine.
Well, okay, I want to, all of your books sort of do that. You use these horror elements to talk about, sort of real life things or the terror that lurks underneath, be it, religious persecution, sort of the loneliness that exists between people, the way you can see the world and it's not quite right, or colonialism. What about horror makes it such a good vehicle for things like that?
Shaun, you want to start?
Oh boy.
It's an easy one.
Yeah, no problem. I'll just speak for an entire genre real quick. And I think it's not just horror, right? I think that genre fiction, or at least the genre fiction, maybe what horror does better than, say, fantasy or sci-fi is lets us talk about things that we can't talk about in other ways, right? And I think Lee's already touched on this a bit. But I think it allows us to look those things. I think good genre fiction lets us look at the big questions right in the eye in a way that maybe realist fiction doesn't always. And horror fiction lets us look at the taboo and the darker side of things in a way that really can be just powerfully honest, I think.
Yeah, I think affect is my big buzzword for that. Is you've got horror, melodrama, erotica, all of those are the feeling genres. They're about your body. You are reacting to that while you're reading it. And I think part of the goal, if you're crafting that style of story, is to think about how to make someone feel strongly about potentially an experience that they might not have had, but even more importantly, if it's one they have had, because you can really work through some of those really powerful, unpleasant, frightening emotions through story in a way that really draws you together also with other people across time, across cultural space, to see what is really going on at the heart of those experiences. And I also think about genre in terms of the Gothic. Like, if I'm writing mostly Gothics because I'm a nerd and I think they're fun, but so much of that is about what's buried beneath, right? Like a glossy, pretty surface. What is rotting underneath that floorboard? And I think culturally in the US, the answer is a lot of things. And if you're writing Southern Gothic, like my first book, Summer Sons, a great deal of that is about where does the money at Vanderbilt come from? A lot of that is historically from chattel slavery. Like, there are all of these questions that we're not asking or purposefully or avoiding, and I think that that's something that I really like to get at in writing Gothics, is it is also about the ghost of the past and how it shapes the present for everyone who has to live in it together in different ways. And I do think that people can be really open to that in speculative work, generally in genre fiction, because there's a metaphor a lot of the time, right? You get the ghost, but then you also get the literal haunting of the past. So you can kind of do both with it. And I think that's fun. Yeah.
This is what I get for letting these two go first. Also, follow the money stories. Lee, you're very good at making friends.
Yeah.
Horror is like the best dancing partner in terms of genre. It can apply to absolutely everything. Life is horror. We come in one of two ways. You're either kicking and screaming and purple and your face is battered and you're tearing your mother open and then you're like, I'm here, Mom, thank you. Here's postpartum depression. Or you have this guy literally slicing your mother open with a scalpel. Those are the two options we have. So life is inherently violent and ugly and horrific. And horror fiction, and to some degree crime fiction too, it's a perfect mirror, right? It's like, here's how I can entertain you while also talking about really, really, really important things. Any Stephen Graham Jones fans in the house?
Yes.
Yeah, Stephen's one of the best
Phenomenal.
to ever do it. We were having a conversation once, and he told me I like to build my books like I build cakes. So it's like all the stuff on the top is genre elements. It's like demonic possession, ghosts, and haunted house stories, and werewolves, and all that stuff. And then inside that, it's the real stuff that I want to talk about. Being a Native American person, living on the res, politics, all that stuff. I think what we all do is sort of like, here's the monsters fucking.
Yeah. What's that about?
We're going to talk about being a person of color. We're going to talk about queerness. We're going to talk about being neurodivergent. It's a beautiful thing that we're seeing right now. Historically, horror was older straight white men talking about their fear of the other. And then at some point, the other said, the queer folks, the BIPOC folks, and neurodivergent folks, and the women, they said, you know what? We can do exactly what you're doing, except we can do it better. So we're gonna retake this mirror, and it's no longer going to be a fear of the other. It's going to be some of the fears that the others have. We've been doing that ever since, and I think that's what makes horror right now so rich and so diverse. And it doesn't matter what you're into. If you're into fantasy, you can do it. You're into gothic, you can find it. If you're into monster fucking, you can find it too. It doesn't matter what you're really into. You can find someone or a group of authors who are doing exactly that. And by all means, if you're looking for something, you don't find it, go write it. We're waiting for it.
Yeah, those are really good answers. Nice job.
I'm going first on the next one. I don't want to follow this too again.
Well, I'll ask a craft one. What do you think makes a truly terrifying scene?
Oh, that's a shitty question, Jimmy. We're not gonna take that one. I teach creative writing. Here's my main thing. I don't know what scares any of you. So it could be demonic possession or poverty. It could be ghosts in your house, or it could be discrimination. It could be, a monster worm, or it could be racism. What I do know is what bothers me. So I can write about poverty. I can write about being afraid of cancer or your kids getting sick. And I think the trick is to find the things that make you feel unsettled, and then dig deep and hurt yourself and dig it out and give it to people and be like, please, can I hurt you a little bit? And then hopefully some of the same things that make me feel unsettled make you feel unsettled. I love vampires and werewolves and ghosts, but I consume that like it's just a comfort food. But then I read about a woman, nonfiction, who survived sexual abuse. That's horrific. Like, that stays with me. That gives me nightmares. Like, this is what humanity is capable of doing. So I think you find that one thing in, or a variety of things. You find like a half a dozen things for every one of your books, and then you just make yourself very uncomfortable for a year, and then you just hope and pray that people buy it. That's about it.
Do you want to go next?
Okay.
I'll go last this time.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm gonna build off of that one to it is about feeling, like I was saying, and I think part of it is digging into very directly what made you feel a certain way, and then seeing how you can provoke that in someone else, or at least have them experience it. And I think the key to the scary scene isn't the scene, it's what you did before it to make the scene happen. Because I do think that really just debilitating dread is one of the main emotions I like to play with in the Gothic, because that is an experience of daily life, walking around in the world when you don't know how a given place is going to be for you to go into. Or you're trying to take a road trip and where are you going to stop to piss? It's a problem. And I think there is something about working through that dread and externalizing it for people that's been really interesting in Woods All Black, as I'm most people pick on this really quickly, so it's not a spoiler, tricking you about what the scary thing is. It's the people in this horrible small town, and religious violence and bodily autonomy. It's not the woods and the monster. The tagline I think they went with is, when they call you a monster, show your teeth. It's maybe what's good is taking over that myth that they've made about you and making them feel as scared as they should be. Revenge stories. So part of the fear is about the other people. And I have seen some interesting responses to it initially where they're like, well, there was no jump scares, so was it a horror book? But I felt awful the whole time. And you're like, yes, that is also an emotion that I was trying to provoke. Yeah.
So I think from just a pure craft place, I don't think thematically I can do better than either of those answers. But I would consider myself not a natural horror writer in terms of my artistic bent leans more towards banter and character and fun. And so when I was writing my first horror novel, Cosmology, I spent a lot of time revisiting some of my favorite horror novels and specific scenes. I spent a lot of time in the that scene in Misery, you know the one, which is one of the most upsetting things I've ever read, and like really started looking at like how does this work in the moment. I think like Lee said, like a lot of it is about building it ahead of time, but then like actually learning to sit with that really uncomfortable thing in a like five senses sort of way, and like how do I evoke that without drowning the reader in detail. What are the specific things that are going to bring that out? And it's something that I still struggle with, honestly, and is really fascinating to me, what works and what doesn't, you know, from book to book. And it is such a personal thing, just like comedy, like what actually makes you laugh, what really scares you versus what you can say like, oh, craft-wise, I can admire this, but it didn't, you know, keep me up at night. So yeah, I think just from a pure like doing the work standpoint, it's a really interesting thing to think about. And that's the only answer that I've come up with, is like learning to sit with it, the things that make me most uncomfortable about the story I'm telling.
So would you say that these books, writing the books, did you get scared? Did you scare yourself? Was it a way of like leaning into like your own personal fears? How does that work out?
I had to write a bunch of church sermons, which really was going back to like some supremely deep-seated psychological trauma from childhood. And I didn't realize how hard that part would be. Like I thought I knew what the hard parts of it would be to get through, because it is like elements of a rape revenge story. And I thought that was going to be the hard thing to write around, but it was definitely having a character who is what we would describe now historically as like Daiki him butch, like not trans mask, but getting close, like coming to this small town and having to go to this church because he wants to help the people who are living in this space, and realizing that he shouldn't be here, but neither should this other person, this young adult who is clearly like a guy, even if his town doesn't think he is, and that he can't leave him there. And so you're trapped, because what are you going to do about that? And it was writing him having to sit in that church and listen to those sermons that really, really got to me. That was rough. But then you tell your friends about it, and you're like, I just wrote this today. Can we go for dinner? I need a beer.
I wouldn't say I necessarily have scared myself, but I have, and this has happened with both books, where it does start to like invade my dreams at a certain point, which I'm not usually somebody who remembers or notices his dreams, but like I've had very vivid dreams at a certain point in writing both books, and which ended up informing some of the imagery that emerged in the book. So I guess in a way, yeah, my subconscious is terrorizing me into doing better work.
Put that on a shirt. I will say this: what we like to call the inciting incident in House of Bone and Rain, which is the mother dying, that comes from real life. That happened to me as I was about to graduate high school, and in a way, I've been sort of writing this novel since like 2000. I just never thought I had the skills to actually use a real life event as an inciting incident without feeling like it was disrespectful, like I was touching something sacred and messing it up. So I'm not entirely sure about the word scared, but typical macho Latino culture is like you take trauma and then you pack it into a ball and then you swallow it and then you never let it out. Like that's your coping mechanism, is denial. And you just leave it there. And then if you decide to become a writer, it's like, here's a knife, go digging. And it's not necessarily scary. It is unsettling. So you need to call your mom once in a while and be like, Mom, can I get a hug? And it's sort of like destroying yourself all over again so you can get to the core of that thing that you've put away for so long. And then there's also about tone and sort of like your voice that you're using in the book, where you get to a point where it's like, in order for it to be effective and mess you up, I feel like it has to mess me up first. Because if I'm like watching TV while I'm writing this and I'm having a good time and texting with someone else, I don't think it packs the punch that it needs. So I think when that stuff comes around, you have to embrace it and be like, I'm going to be deeply uncomfortable for a while, or sad, or angry if you're talking about racism and injustice. And then at some point, I'll eat a cookie and play with the dog. But for the meantime, right now, let's go as deep and ugly and scary as we can so that it actually works for other people as well.
Well said. It's something that's really interesting, too, about all three of these books. I was looking at, I was reading them close back to back, really focusing on everything.
You okay?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is, I can point to specific moments that gave me nightmares throughout the week in each book. Thanks for that. That was terrific. But one thing, you all deal with religion so differently. I mean, for Shaun's book, religion is a system of magic. For yours, religion is like a strength almost and a worldview. And then for yours, we have two different versions of religion in that one. I just wondered if you could talk about why religion and how kind of that influenced the books. I know, easy question.
Yeah.
Look at you because I want to hear this.
Yeah. Well, okay. So it's set in 1929. And the reason it is set in 1929 is because that was a cusp year between the 20s, which was a queer flourishing. There was a black arts movement that was really flourishing in the U.S. and abroad, especially in Paris. Things were happening after World War I. And then it was fascism. And 29 was about the turning point where you start to see that in the U.S. particularly getting much stronger. And that is very purposeful, given the moment we're in politically right now and the ways those things were changing legally, culturally, the increase in violence. And so much of that in the U.S. is Christian, like just to be very direct about it. And people can have very different relationships to that, but I think what I wanted to get at is the relationship I had to have with it growing up when I did, and even to now, the most of the violence that is directed against folks like me and who look like me and et cetera, is coming from a very specific place, and I do want to work on that place because it's a daily issue. That's not a judgment of the entire faith, but there is enough of it that it's a problem, and that is part of what I wanted to get into, was the ways that that violence gets enacted in families, in the space of the church. It can be sexual violence, it can be generally what we would call spiritual violence. And I think that's very common, and we don't talk about it very much. But I wanted to take it back, a good 100 years, because then I do think it's easier to process narratively in the same way the speculative element. So you got a twofer kind of there, where I could get at it and what it would be like to be in that, Church of God house at that point, and it is drawing a lot of experience back into the present to say, what if you could get back at the people who did this to you? Would you? And what would that mean culturally for you? And I think that's where that is. But also we have a protagonist who spent a bunch of time in Paris and doesn't really care. And he doesn't know what he's going to get into. Like, he doesn't really know what he's come to. And I think that happens too sometimes. Yeah, it was rough.
All right, I'm obsessed with religion, and that comes from moving to the U.S. in 2008. My grandma sort of dabbled with Santeria, and that was fine because Puerto Rico is sort of like, it sits at the epicenter of syncretism on a global scale. It's like we had the Taino Indians, and then Spaniards came along. They said, we're not working under the hot sun. Let's go steal people from Africa. So they did that, brought them over. They said, this is your new god. Black people said, fuck that. We're gonna dress all of our old gods in the robes of your new saints, and we're going to keep going. So I grew up surrounded by Christians and Catholics, but also like voodoo and Santeria and Palo Mayombe and Mesa Blanca, and it was beautiful. And everything, whatever your grandma told you is true, right? Like that's a good rule. So everybody had a grandma that was into different stuff, and then when I moved here, all of that went away, and I was like, I need that. Let me put it into the books. Also, when I moved here, I had grown up thinking that whatever religion you participate in is sort of like a set of guiding principles. And then as soon as I moved here, it was like, no, you can't be gay because the Bible says so. I was like, wait a minute, that's not what you should be using religion for. So for example, if the devil takes you home, I have a little mutilation scene that's tied to religion, and then in here it's trying to capture each one of these kids has a different background, and they believe in different things, and how that all can come together. And you can still try to use religion as a force of good instead of like, here's my excuse for judging others. And I think it just makes horror a lot more fun, because I would say, of course, I know people who don't believe in absolutely anything, but about 80% of the folks that I know, when things get tough, they turn to something else. So it's like that oh God moment. It doesn't have to be God, but they turn to something. And I think we need more of that in fiction, because it's like horror, for example, is about you take these characters and you put them through the ringer, and that's your story, right? Same with noir. It's like characters, a bunch of really bad stimuli and how they react and stuff. That's our story. And I think religion plays a huge part of that, because you have that come to God moment when things get really, really dark. It's fun to write about.
Yeah, religion was a big part of my life. My parents met at a Church of Christ college in Searcy, Arkansas. My dad was a preacher for the first few years of my life, and even after he stopped preaching that particular denomination, which is like Baptist plus, kind of, I guess, was a big part of our lives, and something that only sort of fell away very gradually. But growing up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you know, and I'm sure it's no different here, you get exposed to a lot of different versions of Christianity, and a lot of them that I was exposed to were fairly toxic. And I watched, and this is sort of what ended up pulling me out of that faith. I watched how certain churches, certain preachers talked my friends into not being themselves, or to hide parts of themselves, or like, I'm, you know, straight, white, cis man, like I could pass, you know, all I had to do was sit there and be quiet. But like, I would see other people and know that they were struggling with something, and this person was telling them, you know, this is not who you should be, this is not okay. And that is something that made me very angry, and I have stayed angry about, and is a big part of both of my books, I think. And I also feel like religion is a lot of what drew me to horror to begin with, because, I mean, the supernatural horror story, especially the cosmic horror story, is sort of the inverse of the religious experience, right? It's the world is not the world, right? There's something more beyond it, but what is beyond it is so awful and scary, and I don't know. I always thought that was so interesting, and something that I think lingers from my religious upbringing is that desire that to want to believe in something, but also this pessimism that if there is this other thing, it's probably something that would drive me insane or disintegrate me, like a God that does not care about humanity. So it's something I think I will wrestle with for the rest of my life. I don't believe in heaven anymore, but I am still terrified of hell. Yeah, I think it's nothing I'll ever come to an answer about, but I will wrestle with forever, I think.
Can I
got cookies, so.
I'm going to tack on my part two that I forgot, which is I am apparently very superstitious. Like, I'm from Appalachia, it is what it is, and I don't think about it. It's so natural to be superstitious about the natural world, these sorts of things, until you pointed it out. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, there is a sense of, like, the natural world, whatever is behind that we can't tell what it is. It's better to be a little superstitious and be not, right than it is to fuck it up and be wrong. But because I was raised that way in a very rural, like, Appalachian space, it doesn't feel like anything remarkable to be superstitious. It's just how the world is. Maybe there's ghosts. I don't know.
I'm not whistling, but it's because I don't want to.
Yeah, I choose not to.
I choose not to.
Yeah, it's so amazing about another thing that I loved about all of the religious elements in these books is they all have their element of the sacred. Mm-hmm. It's just not necessarily found in the space where you think it will be found. It's something super beautiful. There's so many things that run through all three of these books. It really made me happy to read them together. But I guess I'm going to do one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. But I wanted to ask about non-horror inspirations. What did you draw from that has nothing to do with scaring people?
Does crime fiction count? I find crime fiction also kind of scary. It's whatever moves me. I read across the board. I read poetry because I think it helps you with language, and it helps you with brevity and your pacing. I read a lot of crime fiction. I don't think we should call folks like Stephen Graham Jones or Brian Evanson, we were talking about him earlier. Those are not horror writers; they're just writers. And so it's that, and then a bunch of friends, Bill Boyle, Shaun Cosby, S.A. Cosby. Everything that I read, I try to take inspiration from. If it works, I sort of want to try to do something like it, but that's entirely mine. So if I read, for example, James Ellroy, I'm like, I want my stuff to move that quickly, but I don't want to write like that. Or if I read Stephen Graham Jones, I'm like, so much of who he is in each one of those books. So I want to do that, but I'm not Stephen, so I have to do it with my own life. So everything that I read, and if it sucks, it teaches me what not to do. So it's also kind of like inspiring in a way. It's like, if I'm reading this and I'm yawning, let me take note of why it took 27 pages to make one point, and then make sure that I don't do that. So basically everything that I read kind of inspires me, and movies.
Yeah, I would second the movies part. I mean, obviously I was watching movies before I knew how to read. We all were. But they were my first love before I really fell in love with reading and books. Like, I really wanted to make movies. So that is definitely a huge influence. And it's something that's kind of fallen away, and I don't know if it's movies' fault or just me. I don't know. I'm more interested in reading these days. But yeah, I mean, I went to a fancy pants MFA program. So, I read my Raymond Carver and my Lori Moore, and when I first got to Iowa, they have all of the graduates, their theses you can go check out from the university library. So I went on my pilgrimage and checked out John Irving's thesis, which has Kurt Vonnegut's signature on the front page, and took pictures, and they let you keep it out for an entire semester, so it just sat on my writing desk, as this totem, because the World According to Garp, it's weird. Stephen King's It in junior high, and then Garp in high school were the two books that sort of set me on the path to being exactly this weird Venn diagram that I have become as a writer. So yeah, I really love well-written, just realistic fiction. I really loved, she's actually here today, Clara Lombardo's new book, Same as It Ever Was just amazing. I cried through the last 20 pages of that. So yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of all over the map, and it all goes into the stew. I think it's really healthy for writers to read as widely as possible.
Yeah. Also, jumping on the same, I read basically everything in my day job. I'm a scholar, so I really, really read a little bit of everything. And I think recently there was something that Jesmyn Ward said in the talk that I had to sprint my way over here after because I wasn't missing that. That she goes to film and TV a lot because it is so texturally kind of different from writing prose. And I also am someone who turns a lot to film and TV, and I write about it professionally in the academic job. And lately, I've been doing a lot with a lot of the queer media out of Thailand, because if you're tired of American TV and film, because it's bad mostly right now, there's a whole world out there if you read subtitles. And there's a particular couple of shows recently that I've really been digging. One is called The Eclipse, and it is by a trans woman director who has been involved in politics, and she was organizing the gay marriage bill that recently passed there. And that one is very, very good at thinking about intra-community violence and the ways that we don't show up for each other through the metaphor of a boys' school. But it's very much about politics. And there is another called Not Me that is about political resistance and the different ways that you can do activism all sort of being necessary to one another, whether that's art or sometimes extreme violence, and sometimes it's petitions, and sometimes it's these things. And it is a group of kind of shitty young leftist guys trying to figure out what they're doing wrong, because we've all been or met those guys. And it's also queer, so there is that element too. And I think book-wise, recently I have been doing a lot of work for my dissertation. I'm hopefully defending soon, and then I'll be free. Including L.H. Stallings' Dirty South Manifesto is phenomenal work on sexual culture and gender liberation working from the South, and from things like Dirty South rap music, and from other writers and artists, particularly queer women and queer trans people in the South, thinking about how maybe the lenses that we're trying to use in the legal system are not really sufficient to hold our lived realities, and how we could have a lot more gender liberation if we were working off of how does Big Frida make music, like how is she moving through the world, etc. It's a really good book, pretty recent, very short, and it also has poetry throughout. So you're getting the academic chapter and then a manifesto that's a poem, and then an academic chapter and a manifesto that's a poem, and it is extremely good reading. So that's a big one. And then fiction-wise, it's an obvious answer, but Justin Torres' Blackouts that won the National Book Award this year is as good as everyone says it is. Worth getting a physical copy, because he has interspersed this old sexological text that was like studying mostly lesbians but queer people broadly, that was really heavily redacted by the researchers, and it's like this what could have been a cool anthropological history turned into a shitty medical project. And he takes it and starts blacking out sentences and pages till it's only the words of the people who were interviewed left, not the doctor's commentary, interspersed with a story about a very young queer man in his like late 20s, early 30s, going to the dying bedside of a much older man who is passing away and sort of passing on his last insights about the life that he lived in a very different generation, and it's very inspired by Kiss of the Spider Woman, Manuel Puig. So yeah, it's great, and it's gorgeous. It's printed in like sepia brown tone ink because he wanted it to feel that way when you're reading it, like it's a classic, like a text that's been in a library for a while, fading out. And that was so cool to me, to be like, wow, the pull that you have, he deserves it. But also, like, you had to change the production line to print that book with the photos. Yeah, so very cool. I think that covered 3 zones there.
Well done, well done. Yeah, also, amidst all of these books, there's a pretty good reading list you can pull out of it just on things you all mentioned, from Virginia Woolf to Jim Thompson. So, okay, anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
I do. So I actually want to ask sort of the question that was just asked, but in horror, like, we talk a lot about the old masters, and Stephen King has come up in this conversation, Jaws has come up in this conversation, so lots of old stuff. But I want to hear what you guys are into now, whether it's other writers of novels, horror comics, horror podcasts, horror film. What new horror content by up and coming people like yourselves are you guys into right now?
How much time do we have?
Yeah.
I'm going to take a deep breath and go super fast. Everybody on this panel: Stephen Graham Jones, Paul Tremblay, Josh Matherman, Haley Piper, Cynthia Pelayo, V. Castro, Tananarive Dew, and I'll leave it there because I said I want to give people time. Go.
You go ahead. Okay. Yeah. The Reformatory is phenomenal. I was not supposed to be reading a book that long in the middle of working on my dissertation that is not about my dissertation, but I sure did as soon as it came out. Yeah, absolute masterclass. Perfect. Carmen Maria Machado is always talking about feeling and affect. She gets in there. You will feel a way with that. And recently I saw the TV Glow. I'm going to count it under horror, even though it's more of a gothic. There's always time. You feel a lot, and I recommend seeing it in a theater if you can, because of the sound work that Jane Schoenberg is doing with it. You need to bodily experience that to really have something happen to you. I like experimental film. I like to feel bad, and I did feel remarkably intensely bad afterwards in a way that I welcome. Let's see, other horror recently. I had a whole list too. You do a couple.
Okay. I'll talk about a couple, and yeah. So, yeah. I mean, just a couple things. I would second everything that these two have said, but I just read Rachel Harrison's new book, So Thirsty. All of Rachel's books are a lot of fun. That one just came out this week. They're all great. really love John Langan a lot. His novel, The Fisherman, is 8 years old at this point, so it's not new, but he's still publishing, mostly in the shorter story format. I'm trying to think. Oh, God. Laird Barron, he's got a new collection out that I have not read yet. Yeah, Not a Speck of Light. And it's not new, but I only came to it recently. I've really been enjoying catching up on 200 plus episodes of Welcome to Night Vale. And I got to see them when they came through Dallas not that long ago, and that was a lot of fun. I'm forgetting tons of stuff, but that's what I can remember right now.
As soon as we walk out, 30
Yeah.
names.
One more on my list. More Thai television. Watch gay TV from other countries. Dead Friend Forever. They were doing a queer slasher that then sort of makes a turn halfway through to be like a Who Killed Laura Palmer, like get ready to feel bad about everyone who failed this teenager in his entire life. And it really turns it back on the audience in a way that I found really compelling about like, how do you respond to a story like this? Like, what is your role in wanting to consume it this way that was really like intense and pleasurable in a way that things that are difficult are pleasurable? And it's gorgeous. Love an indie art team also really just making something they want to make with that much joy, especially in film where things are so expensive and so difficult to do, to see something really fresh, like very fun. Yeah.
One other writer I want to mention, L.P. Hernandez, has 2 books that I know of. One is a short story collection called No Gods, Only Chaos, and the other is a novella called In the Valley of Headless Men, and they're both terrific. And Johnny Compton, Spite House, and his new one comes out in a couple weeks, Devils Kill Devils.
Any other questions?
I have a question. This kind of goes back to something that you said, and you said when you mentioned like werewolves and that being like eat it like it's comfort food, and then we talked about trauma, which I haven't read in the books, but that it runs through all. I'm going to. And I hate to use this term. I don't know how you feel about this term. I do not like it, but elevated horror. And so in movies, sometimes I want to watch something like Talk to Me, which is ostensibly completely about grief and trauma of losing a parent, and then sometimes I just want to watch Wrong Turn 2 for the 50th time. And I feel like in movies there still is a place for that. There's still a place for the comfort things and also like things that are completely about trauma, and I love them both. Do you think that there's still a place for that in the literature? Because it seems like it's moving much more quickly into everything needs to be trauma-based or have more of like a background of why this is happening and not just there's a killer. Do you think there's still a place for that comfort food kind of book?
Yeah, I think we are living in the golden age of indie publishers. So whatever you're into, there's a publisher out there. I don't think they're doing books anymore, but Deadite Press out of Portland, they were doing stuff so hardcore that Amazon was like, we need to cover your covers because we can't put those images up on the site. And then they had it kind of went viral a few years ago because there's a few bookstores in Portland asked them to do like the brown paperback thing that they used to do back in the days. There's all of it. Like my only whenever people talk about my work, fantastic, love it, hate it, whatever. You read it, awesome. Thank you for your $2. If you loved it, please let me use those $2 to buy you some tacos. But I think the important thing is to have a little bit of salt on the term elevated horror or literary horror. Texas Monthly called me last year the new king of Texas literary horror. Fantastic. Helped me sell books. Here's my only problem with it. Most of the time, or at least half of the time, when I hear that, it comes from people who don't like Event Horizon, or they're looking for something more elevated. I wrote a short story that's gonna come out in Cemetery Dance next month, I think, which is about some dudes that go up to the caves in the moon and they breathe in something and then it bursts out of their chest. Because I grew up with Alien and I had to pay tribute to that. I like pulp. I have no problem with pulp. I also like high literature. My only thing is I don't think one is better than the other. As a writer, I understand that sometimes reworking a paragraph to make it superb takes longer than just writing a paragraph and keep going because we want blood and guts. The folks that I saw starting to use that was, I don't like horror, but it's okay for me to like this because this is elevated.
And that's what I run into, like what you
Yeah.
watched Zombievers last night, and I'm like,
Yeah. Hell yeah.
And they're like, well, no,
Yeah.
we watch things like The Babadook.
Yeah.
Like, I don't,
Yeah.
in every world where we continue
Yeah.
to have both of these, and I know, I wonder what you're
Yeah, I love it when I encounter folks that are like, hey, have you read? And then they bring out the big stuff, and then you walk out, and then they go, have you seen Velocipastor? And you go, yes! Love it. There's room for everything.
Yeah. I feel like elevated is the part of it that annoys me, and that is because people don't really get literary is also a genre. Like, I do think there's a weird amount of battling that happens between the two. They're both just genre forms. I work in both. I like them both. I find it interesting because especially Summer Sons is so much, it depended on what the audience was bringing to what kind of book they thought it was, and I kind of like to play in that space. For some folks, it was like a queer literary coming-of-age story about grief, and like, what if the best friend that you realize you're in love with died, and it turns out that you were in love with that guy. Not great for you emotionally. But it's also like a haunted house story, and so there are people reading it as just horror, not even just literary, folks reading it as a Southern Gothic. There are people reading it in all these different ways, and some element who are reading it like as a gay romance novel, because there is romance in it. You can really pick and choose how you're going to review it, and I think it was fun to see that, because genre is a suggestion and a description. Like, it doesn't really exist. You're playing with different toolboxes, and that's how I like to think of it. The literary is just one of the toolboxes. It's usually a structure for like how the story moves for me more than anything. But I also like some pulp, and I think that goes back to like horror, erotica, melodrama. Like, we don't like to take them seriously in the academy or in critical spaces, but everyone reads something. Everyone watches something that they're there just to feel very strongly in their body about. And the second part of that, I would say, is it depends on like what your comfort food is. You know, like what thing strikes you as, oh, I'm having to think very deeply about trauma or this historical or social thing, versus, well, no, this is my everyday. That's not remarkable. So like, that's my comfort food. And I think there's some of that in there too, where it's like, what is the thing that you eat for your candy at the end of the day? And I do think that has a lot of flexibility in it, depending on where you, the audience, are kind of reading it from, if that makes sense.
Bigfoot erotica forever. Why not?
Why not?
I don't think I have anything to add there. I think you guys pretty much covered it. I will. I do want to say I have a friend whose ex-husband, to wind down, would watch There Will Be Blood or Scenes from a Marriage, the 6-hour version.
Wow.
I love a film nerd, but that's intense.
Right? Like,
Yeah, I had to take a nap after that one to recover. That is not a wind down.
right. Yeah, this guy sounds intense. Yeah.
How many edibles do you need?
I need a bottle.
Well, I think we're out of time now. Thank you all again so much. Thanks for coming, and come see us at the signing tent.
Thank you.